So you told us that you wanted to earn your own living and wanted to be on your own. And what happened then?
I in fact started to work as a cabinet maker the very next day after I arrived. By the way, I remember going with my aunt into the street the first day, seeing a bakery full with food, with bread, and supermarket, and asking how much is sugar, how much is coffee. Because when I came from Europe, when I left Europe, Europe was still uh, abnormal in terms of what was available. I saw first time a television in a bar, as we passed a bar. Um, the whole beginning was a time of discovery, seeing a new world, a completely new world, new things. I
Did you speak the language?
no, just a few words when I arrived. We learned on aboard ship and just before we left. And so the first thing that I did was to start going to, after work, to evening adult education to learn the language. And I think 4 times a week. After work, I would go to a school called the Roosevelt High School in the Bronx, and very soon thereafter, after I arrived in 1950, the Korean War broke out, as you know, and I was drafted. I wound up going. I was tested for languages and the fact that I knew Europe, and also by the lucky coincidence that I was in the East Coast. I wound up assigned to a activated National Guard headquarters from Washington, D.C., a headquarters and headquarters battery, and I wound up being assigned to the so-called intelligence section, which had no great significance, but that was the section I was assigned to. And after being in the United States for about 6 months or so, we were transferred to Germany. The irony of that is that when I left from Bremenhaven 2 years prior, and as the boat was parting from the shore, I said in my mind, I hope Europe you turn upside down, because the memories that I'm taking from here are very, very sad. Well, anyhow, I wound up in Germany.
Tell me, how did you feel when you first stepped on German soil?
Weird. I can't express the feeling. But we were stationed in a Wiesbaden air base, and our first contact is when you got a weekend pass or so on. In fact, my first weekend pass I didn't spend in Germany. I went to Paris. Next weekend pass I went to Belgium. But by that time, a certain sense of normalization took place in Germany. And we did what soldiers did. We went to bars and whatever. But I spent most of my time visiting the various countries. I went to Italy. At one point while I was in the army, I need to tell you about Captain Spangler. Captain Spangler and one or two of the soldiers, that sergeants that were activated with him from Washington, D.C. Were in fact, in the Second World War. And Captain Spangler was one of the people who liberated a concentration camp. He liberated, I think, Feldafing. And even though some of the soldiers that were from Maryland, for example, or some of the soldiers that were assigned to us to the headquarters battery, I learned about the word kike, and the Ku Klux Klan, and some of them belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. So, I discovered that in America you can also run across to anti-Semitism or anti-something, anti-black, anti-whatever. Well, it was sort of a new discovery, but it was part of the way things were. But Captain Spangler, when he found out that I was in the camps, of course, we had a very unusual rapport. He told me anything and everything that he can do for me, just ask, and in fact he did. By that time, somewhere shortly after 1948, my mother immigrated from my hometown to Israel. My brother, who was in Cyprus, was also now in Israel. And since we were in Germany, I was stationed in Germany, the first thing that I did, I went to see Captain Spangler, who then, I told him that I'd like to use my furlough to go to Israel. And with his help, although I had only, I think, 8 days coming to me, with his help, I had a 3-day pass before, a 3-day pass after. It wound up to be a 3-week trip, almost 3-week trip, because I had to go with the boat from Naples. He took me into the kitchen, because I was buying different things, like I went to Paris to buy kosher salami to take it to Israel. Then he took me once into the kitchen, and he said to the sergeant in charge there, David is going to Israel. First time he's going to see his mother in Israel. Don't we have any things here that we can be without? Sure, Captain. Big can of cacao, another can full of chocolate, and I was loaded up, given a special truck with a special pass, loaded on a train in Frankfurt, and down all the way to Naples. And when I arrived to Naples, I had the equivalent of 600 pounds of different things, different cans, and so on. Anyhow, that's the first time that I visited Israel, 1951.
What religion was that, Captain Spangler?
I honestly don't know. To me, of course, it didn't matter. He was not Jewish as such, but other than that, the aspect of religion wasn't anything that we would take in consideration. Anyone that respected somebody, that was it. I recall an incident sometime during the time that I was in Germany. We became, up to that point, we were known as the occupying Allied soldiers. A rule came out one day that from now on we will be defensive forces. And he came over to me and he said, David, what do you think of this irony? After all you have been through, in essence, if a war breaks out, you would have to defend this soil. And I said, all my life is ironies. This is just one other irony. So, like I said, that's the first time I visited Israel.
When were you discharged from the army?
I was discharged from the army 2 years after I went in. Either I went in September, discharged in October, or vice versa. 1952.
And where did you go?
I returned back to New York, and I started to work again, because while I was in Israel, I saw the conditions there at that time, and I looked up to God, and I said, these people are going to wind up eating each other alive, because the misery and that was in Israel with all the groups and boats of people arriving, no order, no work, nothing available. So I took my whole savings. My mother was living out in a factory shack somewhere, one of my relatives that had a factory there. I took my savings, borrowed some money, and I bought for her an apartment within that period of time. And so in New York, I started to work again. Same thing, cabinet making. And shortly thereafter, I went to visit, I heard about some relatives that lived in Cleveland, Ohio. I remember getting snowed in and watching the Army McCarthy hearing, the Joseph McCarthy story. That's what I saw, what can take place even in America, when somebody gets too cocky. But in any case, shortly thereafter, I decided, because the hunger of making up lost school years was always with me. Here I was in a country like America, where everybody has at least a high school education, or where in order to achieve anything, you have to speak the language and you have to have some education. So I had the chance, because I was in the army during the Korean War, I was considered a Korean veteran, even though I was serving in Europe. And I had what's called the GI Bill of Rights coming to me. And so I wound up in Chicago, and I attended Chicago Technical College for close to 4 years. And I got a degree which is an engineering degree, but not a full engineer. It's in essence, a technician, engineering technician degree. And when I finished school, I decided that I'm going to go as far away from the East Coast or from Chicago as far as I can. And I heard about Los Angeles, that it has always summer, palm trees. And I said to myself, if I can be in a place where there is no snow, not to remember those marches from Auschwitz, where whenever I saw snow, for some reason or other, I saw blood and guts. So I decided, and I arrived to Los Angeles with a degree in my hand. I went to work for the State Highway Division here for a brief time. And then my mother kept writing to me, you finished, you're an engineer, I have a son an engineer, I miss you, and I want to see you, and so on. So I decided to go, and I went for a 2 months visit to Israel. And the difference between 51 when I was there to 58 when I was there is something that I deemed a privilege to have experienced. At that time, I also, what happened during that period of time, my older sister, who had gotten married in Romania and had 2 children, was trying to immigrate to Israel. And this, she tried, I think, to leave about 1957. And just as they were getting ready to leave, the Romanians stopped the immigration for some reason. They couldn't get out of Romania. While I was in Israel in 58, I heard that in Antwerp there are people who can arrange passports, who know, the diamond business is an international business and everybody knows about movements all over the world. I went to Antwerp and tried to get a passport for them. At that time, the way it worked is cost about $3,000 per head to get a passport. It was a backdoor kind of dealing with the Romanian government, but it was not an official kind of thing. Unfortunately, I was told that all passports are used up by the Catholic nuns and priests, and there are no passports available for Jews, so I had to leave it go, left, came back to America, and ultimately my sister waited on a suitcase for 3 years, and she wound up going to Israel in 1961 with her husband and 2 children.
And when you returned to Los Angeles then, what did you do?
I worked briefly in engineering. During my trips to, like I said, I was in Paris, I met some artists, and I got to know some artists and learned a little bit about the art world. And in fact, there was an artist from my hometown living in Paris. That's how the whole thing started. His name was Francois Gall. He's not alive anymore. When I came back, I worked briefly in an engineering, for an engineering firm, ran into a situation where the partner in the firm turned out to be an anti-Semite, lost my job, was very disgusted. By coincidence, the owner of the building where I lived, when I was renting an apartment, had a art gallery. And he had a fireplace shop. That was his original business, and he bought this art gallery. And his manager of the art gallery got sick. He asked me to help him out for a few weeks. The week became a whole year. And I saw the possibility, because I always also, as I told you, I had the knowledge of cabinet making, so making frames was a natural thing for me. So I saw a possibility in that. And so I decided at one point, somewhere in 1962, that I'm going to try my hand at opening a little gallery and a frame shop. And that's how I went into the frame shop business and art business. And I, in essence, did that to very recently, and I'm in fact still active in the art business. During this time, an incident that I'd like to tell you about. As I told you, my younger sister married, in fact, a fellow that was an ardent communist, and he remained in Romania. And for all practical purposes, we didn't have any communication because they were scared to write a letter out of the country, and you know, Stalinist period, post-Stalinist period. So my brother-in-law was working in the government. Everybody worked in the government, but in any case, he was, I think, a propagandist, if I remember correctly. In 1963, I was now in the art business. I went to Vienna and to Budapest to buy paintings. At that time, you could buy from the government paintings. And I ran across a gentleman by the name of Nadler, accidentally in a coffee shop. We started to talk to each other, and I asked him, where is he from? And he says, Nagybánya. I said, you're from Nagybánya? I don't know you. I'm from Nagybánya. So it turns out he's from one of the towns that was near Nagybánya and came in after the war. I wrote a letter quickly, and I asked him, do you know my sister, Eva Biro? She said, yes, we are neighbors. And in fact, they are my brothers. He's my brother-in-law, and that's my sister. Take this little message. Message read, dear sister, imagine how I feel. I'm sitting here, I don't know, 100 miles as the crow flies from you. I don't dare to pick up the phone to call you and so on. I'm here. I can come every year, if you like, to Budapest. I'm buying paintings here and so on and so forth. By the time I got back to America, there was a letter waiting for me under the name of an old doctor neighbor of my sister, written under her name. And I was able to respond to that address because my sister didn't want to correspond with me. Anyhow, we made a secret rendezvous. I went for my mother to Israel a year later, in 1963. Took my mother to Budapest, and my sister organized so that their vacation, behind the Iron Curtain, they could easily travel from one country to the other. So we met in Budapest. In fact, she didn't tell my brother-in-law to the last minute that we are arriving. When she told my brother-in-law that we are arriving, he left, went back to Romania. Question why? Well, on one hand, he was scared to meet because, they were afraid of their own shadow. So I always have to assume that's the case. In any case, that's the first time I saw my sister since 1948 with 2 children, visiting with each other. We realized what the situation is. It was my mother who told me at that time, when we had a minute privately, you're my youngest, you're not married. Until you have breath in you, I want you to make an effort to get these children out of here. And in fact, that became my, as the French says, raison d'être, my reason for being. Unfortunately, it took me 13 years. It was 1975 before I finally succeeded to get them all out of there. So now they live in Israel, and my sister has the 2 daughters. One got married to a boy from Mexico whose father then had a heart attack. He had to return to Mexico, so he lives in Mexico, has 2 boys. And my other niece has 2 girls. And that, in essence, is what took the focus of my life. Like I said, in the interim, I was in the art business. I had slow, difficult times, but thank heavens, right now I'm okay, if I can say that.
Were you ever married?
No, I was not. That's a very personal thing. I have conscientiously decided not to have children. I don't know, you can deduct as to where it's coming from and how it comes about. At least the idea was that until I feel the ground under my feet, until I stop running scared. I will not have children. I was hoping to eventually go to Israel, and if I would have gone to Israel, this whole thing would have been different. But in 1958, it was one reason why I couldn't do it. Then it was trying to get my older sister out. It was another reason why I couldn't do it. And like I said, I go frequently to Israel, and I hope maybe to retire to Israel, but in fact, that's the reason that I wound up unmarried.
Is there anything that I did not ask that you wanted to talk about?
Coincidental with your previous question. You see, outwardly, I'm fairly successful in my art business, considered an expert in certain areas. Things happen, if not weekly, but sure, it's not daily, but surely weekly. I'll tell you this way. I came to America just about during the time when the Nuremberg trials were on. In the DP camps yet, we found out that there were those who were true refugees, and that there were, I'm talking about non-Jews, and then there were those who were running away because they were in the fascist armies, or they were guards in the camps and all that. And I don't know how that happened, that they mixed them all up and they became refugees from communism. Every now and then we would run across, we hear that so-and-so capo turned up, or so-and-so SS captain turned up, or a Hungarian vicious murderer turned up here and there. In fact, the Americans were recruiting some of them. And when we heard about it, for example, the Lithuanian volunteered to the SS, the Litau volunteered to the SS, the Polish volunteered to the SS. When we heard about them, everybody was winking to each other. They're going to put them on a boat, and they're going to sink the boat. That's the illusion we were living under. In fact, we were later to realize then they came on a priority to America. They had some kind of a plan that they would drop them behind the Iron Curtain or something. Okay, I found out in the beginning, you have the Nuremberg trial, okay? Then there was something they called denazification. Beautiful word, denazification. It rhymes with delisation or something like that. What it meant is that whatever hocus pocus that they said, you're not a Nazi anymore, now you're okay. So we had the denazification.
Let's stop for a minute. But, okay, so we were talking about the post-war Nazis.
Numerous things come into play, into being at that time. For example,